Hello, everyone. This presentation is to provide an update on Ohio cottage food rules and guidance for clients that might come to your county offices, particularly for those of you who weren't available for our live webinar a few weeks ago. So for people who are looking to get into cottage food production, oftentimes they come and they ask you questions that have to do with rules or regulations. What are they allowed to do? What aren't they allowed to do? And they're not so much interested in learning about food safety. But if they're asking you questions, it's an opportunity to provide some food safety education as well. So certainly, cottage foods are a list that exists because they're considered to be relatively low risk, but it's still possible to make people sick through cottage food production in the absence of appropriate food safety strategies. And so, bearing in mind too that foodborne disease is super common even in the United States, there are about 50 million cases, which works out to be 1 in 6 people each year. And for some people, there can be serious disease outcomes associated with these foodborne pathogens that also contribute to significant economic burden. So, kind of be structuring your thinking on this topic into those two categories. One is what are the rules, and the other is what are some best practices to recommend to people to promote food safety. When we think about food safety, especially in cottage food production, I would focus your recommendations around two types of hazards. One is microbiological. Those are pathogens like bacteria, viruses, and parasites that can cause illness potentially in consumers as a consequence of infection or consumption of a toxin that the microbe has produced. So these pathogens include microbes like pathogenic E. coli or listeria or salmonella or botulism, which is a toxin producer, or staph, which is a toxin producer. And they're found in various sources in the environment or carried by people or on your raw ingredients. And so, appropriate handling and cooling or heating or packaging of these products is important to ensure food safety, as is the prevention of cross contamination. So, the cook, chill, separate, and clean recommendations from the USDA still hold true here as well. Typical symptoms of foodborne disease caused by microbiological hazards are those related to gastrointestinal distress, like vomiting and diarrhea, but certainly there are other exceptions as well. Another category of hazards that is definitely relevant to cottage food producers are chemical hazards, notably allergens. So there are 8 major allergens in the United States that include wheat, milk, eggs, soy, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, and shellfish. And when I say in the United States, it's not that allergen sensitivities necessarily vary. It's that these are the ones that require labeling in the U.S. and account for the majority of food allergen responses. So symptoms can be mild, like a rash, or very serious, like anaphylaxis or death. And it's relevant to cottage food because as you look through that list of potential chemical hazards, you'll note that a lot of them are ingredients in popular cottage food products. That includes baked goods that could have wheat or milk or eggs or soy or the nuts. Less commonly fish and shellfish, but it's not impossible. So it's important to keep those in mind too, as especially as people become increasingly aware and recognize allergens as a potential food safety hazard. So moving into the discussion on cottage foods, it's first, I think, useful to develop an understanding or a definition of what cottage foods are and are not. So one of the main points in giving good advice on cottage food operations is to understand what qualifies as cottage and what does not. And so sometimes people use cottage foods just kind of as a general group without specific definition to mean home produced or kind of quaint, old timey type products, but it's actually a more concrete set of potential items. So as a group, they're defined by being relatively low risk, and we'll talk about that in a second, but meaning that they are, by virtue of how they're formulated or processed, less likely to contain pathogens in the finished product. Cottage foods are those produced in a home kitchen, and we'll break down that definition further as well too. But that is one of the definitions associated with cottage food production, which is appealing to small food processors. Um, Additionally, to meet the definition of cottage foods, it has to be produced in a home kitchen. So if you are doing a larger scale up of your baked goods in a shared use kitchen facility and or like a church kitchen because they have more ovens, all of a sudden you're not home producing anymore and you're not subject to the cottage food exemption. So it must be produced in a home on home scale equipment. So you can't just make a pilot plant in your basement either. They can be sold in Ohio, so that's a restriction as well. You can't take your cottage food production and sell those products across state lines. And it includes a limited list of products. Again, those that are organized or selected based on their relative low risk, but it's a specific list of products. So it's not any kind of canned food, it's not any type of baked good. Okay, and we have cottage food regulations, one, because it's an opportunity for small businesses to develop without investment in more significant infrastructure. And because they're relatively low risk, that kind of helps justify the trade off for a lot of these cottage foods laws that exist across the US. And so that's the benefit of having those on the books, is that they can be produced in home kitchens without license requirements. And these products are typically characterized by being acidic. Like here I have a picture of a raspberry jam, which would be high acid, low pH. Or they are low water activity. So that's a product like a baked good that's kind of dry, for example. Or it could be both, high acid and low water activity. So you have lots of sugar in a jam. That helps lower the water activity as well. And the notable part of those two attributes, pH and water activity, is that they help limit microbial growth. And so that is one of the ways, one of the contributing factors to the relative low risk status of this category. So here's some examples. What we mean here, kind of conventional cottage foods. It includes shelf-stable baked goods like cookies or donuts that don't have a filling in it. It includes popped corn and like candy coated popcorn, like this popcorn ball, granola and candy, and then high acid jams and jellies. So this is an example of cottage foods on the Ohio Cottage Food Law list. But as I said, one of the most important types of recommendation or types of guidance that you'll be asked to provide to cottage food operators is an understanding of what cottage foods are not. So it is a specific list of products. You can check the list, and if it's not on the list, it's not a cottage food. Of course, there are gray areas, and you might have questions about whether or not something would be exempt under the cottage food law or not. In that case, you're always welcome to ask. You can contact sometimes your local health department, but ODA or me or someone else in extension to figure out whether or not that's the case. So in addition to being on the list, as I mentioned, they must also be produced in a home kitchen. So in your home residence on home scale equipment in order to be considered a cottage food and exempt from direct inspection. If you want to look up the rule itself, it's chapter 3715 of the Ohio Revised Code. I would suggest you Google Ohio Cottage Food Law, and that'll take you to the landing page for ODA's website on the topic, which has been revised and is quite accessible now. So there you'll find a list of what is considered cottage food. So cottage food includes baked goods, those that are not refrigerated, that don't require refrigeration. So true cottage food baked goods are things like bread and cookies and brownies and cake and fruit pies. I'll show some examples on the next slide of things that are not. But you can imagine refrigerated baked goods like cheesecake or filled donuts or pies that require refrigeration, cream cheese-based icings, for example. Also on the list of cottage food products are candy. So you can think of hardtack candy, for example. Those confections are considered cottage foods, as are fruit jams, jellies, chutneys, and butters. So this is kind of a general preserved category for high acid fruits. So apple, pear, raspberry, peach, you can go down the line. but these are not acidified products. So things like tomato salsa that has a high acid component like tomato and a low acid component like peppers and onions and cilantro would not be considered a cottage food. Additionally, pumpkin butter is low acid, so it would not be considered a cottage food either. But apple butter would be because that's a high acid fruit. Honey or honey products, if you are also the person who owns the bees, those are exempt from direct inspection, as are granola and granola bars dipped in candy. So, like if you have a chocolate coated granola bar, for example, popcorn and candy coated popcorn. We talked about the popcorn a second ago. Unfilled baked donuts. So I think you can probably guess here that filled baked donuts are not on the cottage food list. That's something that would require refrigeration. The filling changes the water activity at that interface of the donut and the filling. Waffle cones or waffle cones dipped in candy. There's Pizzelli things too. These are all kind of, again, shelf stable baked good products, just like dry cereal and snack mixes. Roasted coffee, which can be whole or ground, dry baking mixes, and then mixes of spices or tea blends or soup mixes. So you purchase in these dry ingredients, you combine them, and you sell that blend. That would be considered a cottage food. Here's examples of what aren't cottage foods. So anything that requires refrigeration. So if you refrigerate it, then it's not a cottage food item. So I mentioned those other baked goods that require refrigeration. You can, again, think about a cheesecake or a pumpkin pie. Those would not be considered cottage foods. Chocolate-covered fruit also requiring refrigeration. So while candy is considered cottage, chocolate-covered fruit is not. Freezer jam is not. It's not shelf stable. I mentioned the acidified canned foods. So obvious ones are pickles or relishes, but even a lot of those tomato products are acidified. So just because it's a canned food does not mean it's a cottage food that you can sell it without inspection. Sugar-free jams, jellies, and fruit butters are not considered cottage food. So it's a pretty narrow list of canned foods. It's fruit preserves that contain a high acid fruit, sugar, pectin, water, maybe a little bit of lemon juice for the pectin or citric acid to make the pectin function appropriately. But it's a pretty small list of items that are included. Popping corn, so not popped corn, but popping corn is not cottage food. Fry pies, salsa, right? So salsa is another example of an acidified product that I mentioned above, as are these hot pepper butter, pumpkin butter, nut butters that are low acid products. Hummus, again, refrigerated. Belgian waffles, while the waffle cones are cottage food, Belgian waffles are not. Cream cheese frosting and jerky. These are all examples of foods that are not under the cottage food exemption. So to touch back on food safety, what are the hazards with these products? The first one is basically you make a mistake and you think you are producing something that is a cottage food and it is not. And so that increases the potential risk for hazards that you don't have a control for because you have not correctly produced it. So if you're producing an acidified product and you're selling it as a canned food, well, you probably should have done more due diligence in verifying or validating the process for production of that food. And so that may increase the risk. So mistakenly thinking you're making a cottage food and not, and so that increases the risk that you don't have appropriate controls in place. The other risk is cross-contamination. So poor sanitation from your kitchen or from you or someone else making the food in your kitchen can contribute to illness. So there's been in Cleveland recently an outbreak of norovirus in donuts, not cottage food produced, but cases where because of the employee's health status, the food handler's health status, they caused an outbreak. This is also true for allergens. So cross contact because you put chocolate chip cookies and peanut butter cookies on the same piece of parchment paper and now you have peanut residue in your chocolate chip cookies and you didn't declare that allergen, that can create food safety hazards as well. So the second one here is really about cross-contamination with pathogens or cross-contact with allergens. However, pre-approval, license, and registration is not required to produce cottage foods. If you're not sure if you qualify for the exemption, again, you can ask. You can direct people to county extension offices or to me or to the Ohio Department of Agriculture's Food Safety Division or to potentially their local health department as well. So you don't have to get a license or pre-approval. You do have to label the product. And you should note where you can sell it. So it cannot be sold across state lines. So if you live in a border county, that can be potentially challenging for people, but it can't be sold across state lines. It can, however, in Ohio, be sold to grocery stores and farmers markets and restaurants who are also then able to use them in their own food products. You are allowed to make those sales in Ohio. The two categories that kind of most frequently get confused with cottage foods, I talked about acidified canned foods already, so pickles, relishes, salsas that get confused for cottage food products just because they're also canned, and also home bakery products. So that's kind of those refrigerated items that should not be sold as cottage food products because they require temperature control for safety. So, as an alternative, home bakery products, again, some of these refrigerated baked goods like cheesecake and pumpkin pie, um, those could still be produced at home under a home bakery license. So, that is an alternative um, for people who are looking to manufacture those types of products. The difference here in between cottage foods that are baked goods and those baked goods that have to be produced under a home bakery license is the temperature control issue. So a lot of these home bakery license baked goods are like coconut cream pies. I mentioned pumpkin and cheesecake. Um, like chocolate mousse pies that require refrigeration. And so the higher water activity here, so normally we talked before that these shelf stable baked goods are controlling microbial growth through low water activity. These higher water activity products require refrigeration. And without appropriate refrigeration, you can get growth of pathogens, which can increase the risk of food safety issues for consumers. So, temperature abuse is extended storage at room temperature, so between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit for excessive amounts of time. That is the risky scenario for products produced under a home bakery license where refrigeration is necessary to promote their safety. So, temperature management for the home bakery products is going to be important, as is still preventing cross-contamination. And you can kind of see, again, the difference here. The fruit pies above, these are cottage foods. The refrigerated pies below. This is in a commercial location, but they could be produced under a home bakery license option. If you have a client who wants to pursue a home bakery license, there are some additional rules, like you can't have terrestrial pets living in the house, and you have to have mechanical refrigeration. So for some Amish processors, that can be a limitation. But it does also require a pre-inspection from an ODA inspector. They come to your house and they look around for a little bit to ensure that you meet the requirements for the home bakery license. And then you're good to produce these products in your home as well. The other category here is the acidified products, the canned foods that are not considered cottage products. They have a low acid component, like a vegetable part, like a cucumber or a pepper, and a high acid component, like a vinegar brine, most commonly. And so the risk here is that you don't properly acidify the low acid component, the vegetable part, and that can lead to botulism. So Clostridium botulinum will grow and germinate and produce toxin in low oxygen environments, and we control that with acidity. And so having the right formulation and the right processing conditions is how you make sure we don't kill people with botulism. I mentioned before that the symptoms of most foodborne illness are vomiting, nausea, diarrhea. For botulism, it's a neurotoxin, so paralysis and death are the symptoms. So it's a serious issue, and so that's why these are also separate categories. So acidified foods include pickles, like cucumber pickles are kind of the most obvious ones, but it can also include some barbecue sauces or some dressings and salsas and other red sauces. Some beverages, like a tea that has a lemon acidifier, some jams, depending on what they are. can be acidified. And so this is its own category and it requires a lot more regulatory oversight. So if you have clients who are interested in producing acidified foods, then they will need to produce in a commercial facility. So that might be a licensed shared use kitchen facility nearby. And it also requires working with a process authority, so I have that contact information specified here. Taking Better Process Control School, which is a class that teaches food safety. You work with ODA to make sure that your facility is inspected, and you file the scheduled process you get from the process authority with the FDA if you're producing acidified food products. So, as a quick thought experiment, um, I have listed several products here. They are cucumber pickles in a vinegar brine, pumpkin pie, raspberry jam, and chocolate chip cookies. So, without information on where it's produced, the question is which of these are cottage foods? If you guessed that the raspberry jam and chocolate chip cookies are cottage foods, that is correct. The pumpkin pie could be produced under a home bakery license, and the pickles are an acidified food, so that would have to be produced in a commercial facility. So hopefully this gives you kind of a high-level overview of the most commonly asked questions about cottage food, some guidance on how to answer those most commonly asked questions. Again, if you need additional information, I would look up the cottage food reg on ODA's website, and you can direct any other questions to me or to your food safety regulators within your county. Thanks. An additional aspect of the cottage food rule is that it does include labeling requirements. So the product has to be labeled and it must comply with other labeling requirements. Again, if you Google Ohio Cottage Food Law, the ODA website will lay out those labeling requirements. But it includes the business name and address and the product name for traceability purposes, the contents and ingredients, so that also addresses allergens, right? Allergen declaration. And then notably, this has to additionally include in at least 10-point font the statement, this product is home produced. The idea is to be transparent and disclose to consumers that this product was not manufactured in an inspected food facility. So that is required for cottage food production.